Hi, are we live?
I hope so. God, I hope
That's
Okay.
so.
what it says on the screen. I don't know if that means, yeah.
Hello and welcome to the Slow Burn Fiasco Quarantine Cast. I am Noreen Malone and I am the host of the upcoming season of Slow Burn, the 2021 Slow Burn, on a lead up to the Iraq War. And I am joined here for the first time ever in one place, all of the previous hosts of Slow Burn. So, guys, I'm going to let you go around and introduce yourselves. Let's do it in actually reverse chronological order. So, Josh, you go first.
I am both first and last, as
Right, true.
I'm the only person in the known universe, me and Gabe Roth, to have worked on all the Slow Burn seasons. And I was the host of Slow Burn season 4 on David Duke, following Joel Anderson.
What
That's
a
me.
great tee up.
Yeah, was that a great, thanks for queuing me up. Yes, I'm Joel. I was the host of season 3, Biggie and Tupac. I am a staff writer at Slate currently, and I took over the franchise from the originator, the founder here, who I guess I'm trying to tee you up too. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I appreciate it. I felt it coming. I'm Leon Neyfakh. I worked at Slate from 2015 until 2019, and was the first host of Slow Burn, the Watergate season, which we followed up with the Clinton season. And I am now the host of a new podcast called Fiasco, which is currently in its third season. It's also a podcast about political history. We did a season on the 2000 election, then Iran-Contra, and currently, we are putting out a season on, the desegregation of Boston's public schools.
And where do we find Fiasco, Leon?
On Luminary, the paid subscription service.
Great. Okay, so Leon or Josh, I'm going to start with you guys because you are the people who worked on season 1 and came up with the entire concept. Maybe you can just talk to us about how it came to be and what were the choices that you made then that you've seen play out over the every season since, the sort of original choices that defined Slow Burn.
Leon, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, so I'd been interested in podcasting for a while. I've been a writer at Slate for my whole time there up until Slow Burn started. I've been covering criminal justice, and then when the Trump administration started, I sort of narrowed my focus to just be about the excuse me, my voice is going.
Your golden voice, it's your ticket. What are you going to do?
I know. So after the Trump administration started, I started covering the Department of Justice, which led me to be the one to sort of get the call when the decision was made to try to start a podcast about Watergate, which at the time felt like a very relevant historical reference point because of everything that was happening with Trump and the Mueller investigation. And so because DOJ had such a sort of key role in the Watergate investigation, I was sort of the guy to sort of get the invitation. And so I had been, interested in podcasting for a while. I'd never really I feel like I never really found like at Slate the kind of outlet for like narrative journalism that I always wanted to do. Like, it was much more opinion driven and often reported, but still analytical. And so this was just an amazing opportunity to try to flex the narrative muscles, and basically make a piece of reporting, but about the past instead of the present.
And Josh, what was the thinking behind doing the Watergate thing at all? Can you tell us about that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it came up in one of our cover story meetings, which you've been a part of, Noreen, where people just on staff pitch ideas. And as Leon said, back in the early days of the Trump administration, Watergate was a comparison that a lot of people were making. This was not necessarily an original idea within Slate to see parallels and look for parallels between what was going on in the Nixon administration and the Trump administration. But so Slow Burn didn't start off as like, let's do a series on historical narratives and what would be the best first topic to look at. The idea was, let's do a podcast about Watergate. Leon was tapped for it, not just because of his subject area expertise, but because he did have and continues to have a great mind for narrative journalism and the kind of like feature level scope that we wanted in this project. And so he was the perfect person to take it on. And it turned out, I think, to be, we thought that it was going to be good. I think it turned out better than, I don't know if it turned out better than you thought it would, Leon, but I think it just turned out so well that it kind of spawned this franchise.
And what do you guys, and Joel, jump in here too, what do you guys think of as the distinctive slow burn features? You know, this wasn't the first history podcast, so what made it different? Why did people kind of listen to it differently?
I mean, for me, I think the big insight in that first season was to limit the show's perspective to what people knew at the time. I think we kind of stumbled onto a mode or a formula that allowed us to kind of re-inject suspense into stories where, you know, that were very famous and that had endings that everyone was aware of when they started listening. I think kind of committing all the way to this idea that we are going to explore or describe what this felt like at the time, rather than what it looks like in hindsight. To me, that was always sort of the first step in figuring out what the show was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for me at least, as somebody that came in after the franchise was already established. I don't know about you all, but I've never had a history class that ever got as far as Watergate. And I think that given the parallels that the first two seasons weren't necessarily coy about with our current political moment. I definitely think that's why it resonated so much, and why people were ready for it to sort of, think about all the things that went on back then that maybe we missed in the lead up to what's happening now. And it was like a blueprint for me at least, in terms of how to tell a story and make old news live again. So.
Yeah, but there's also you have the benefit of time, right? You're imagining a universe as it was in 1970, whatever, 1990, whatever, or 1980, whatever. But you can also sort of look more clearly than someone could at the time at, I always think of the episode that you did, Leon, on feminists and, Monica Lewinsky and the sort of failure there as like, it's a chance to sort of go through things as they were, but also with the clarity of however much time has elapsed. Something I've been thinking.
Yeah, and that goes for the reporting too, right? I mean, like, I don't know about the rest of you, but like I found and continue to find that it's much easier to break new ground and also to get people to speak candidly about things that happened, a decade or 2 or 3 ago, as opposed to like trying to chip away at an ongoing news story where you're competing with everybody and everyone is sensitive and everyone has, some investment in the outcome. Whereas with Watergate, like we just, we found that people were just happy to kind of tell us all their stories and they didn't seem all that guarded compared to sort of what I was used to.
Yeah, I mean, in the season that I'm reporting now on the lead up to the Iraq War, a lot of people are also in kind of like ass covering mode where they are trying to, do penance for their sins of almost 20 years ago. They're sort of trying to say, oh, well, I know better now, which is kind of people are more willing to talk than they were contemporaneously, certainly.
You maybe had a slightly different experience, Joel, because these murders were so painful for folks that you spoke to, and I guess there were probably other reasons, but I don't feel like it was necessarily as easy for you to get people to talk as it maybe was to get people to talk about Watergate, for instance. Yeah, and I mean, I know I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit later, but yeah, no, it was very difficult, and there's all sorts of reasons for that, right? There are plenty of people that I wanted to speak to that are entertainers in their own right, that want to tell the story. They want to take ownership of the story and tell it themselves. A lot of people don't even know a lot of the people that I wanted to talk to don't even know what the hell Slate is, right? The people that we spoke with that knew Slate were journalists, but when I'm reaching out to Lil C's of the Junior Mafia, like that's not, unfortunately Slate is not, something that he's regularly reading. So that made it really difficult too. And then, yeah, I mean, I think there was a concern that people have been exploitative about this story. Lots of people tried to make money off the stories of Tupac and Biggie.
and they've not necessarily done it, ethically or with care or anything like that. And so there was a lot of concern about that. It's not like I'm a hip hop journalist, I'm just a journalist. So I had to introduce myself and Slate to a whole group of people that had never heard it before.
Yeah, I was forwarded the emails that you sent as a reach out, and I found it impressive. I would have talked to you had I been in a position to shed some
Really?
light.
You saw
So you did a good.
Thank you.
Um, well,
And I had the
I'd like.
experience, Noreen, of trying to get people who had worked with or for David Duke to talk to me.
Yeah.
And I think maybe similar to what you were talking about with the Iraq War, there are people that understand now that that's not a socially acceptable position. But I think being a Duke supporter or employee is maybe harder to walk back from or step away from than being a supporter of the Iraq War, because you had a lot of company being an Iraq War supporter. Like, most of the people at the place, at a lot of the places that we've worked for instance. So it's
Right.
it's interesting.
How did you decide to handle that? Like, how much slack did you cut them on that? Like, did you give them much room for sort of on-air apologia, basically? Or like, did you cut most of it?
I didn't get that many of them to talk to me, so I didn't
Yeah.
I didn't have many opportunities to make that editorial decision. I wish I would have had more, but the woman Michelle Shower, who
I think that's who I
is
was thinking of. Yeah.
a part of the back half of the series, I included pretty much all of her kind of self-reflection, like anything that she had in there that was by way of like explaining why she made the decision that she made to sign on with him. I think it's in the podcast, because that was sort of the whole point, is to talk to somebody who you might, kind of reads as being a reasonable person who was making decisions at the time that were based on, careerism to some extent, based on, feeling like she was making a decision that wasn't that big a deal. And she could sort of explain it to herself at the time. And I think we heard that explanation. And I think that was really valuable to be able to hear that. And so she was kind of a stand-in, I think, for all the people like her who did similar things.
Yeah, I mean, to me, those can be often the most interesting interviews, where you listen to the person and you can tell that you're getting a version of events and even a version of what they remember that is in certain specific ways and identifiable ways, self-serving and self-absolving, right? And I think as long as you build context around that kind of footage, it can be as illuminating as something that you can look at and say is the absolute objective truth. Like, I think people's self-delusions, are often, really fascinating and tell you a lot about why things unfolded the way they did. Because those delusions, even if they're delusions, are extremely powerful.
Yeah, I have a sort of pet theory that listeners are more willing to go along with you on something like that, to trust that you are not necessarily always signing on to the views of whoever you're talking to in the podcast form than in the magazine profile form. Like, things are less likely to be sort of taken out of context, and you can sort of listen to the whole thing in one go without the noise of criticism. I just think it's a good forum for it. So speaking of things that are suited to podcasting, we've already talked about how season 1 came to be, but I'm actually very genuinely curious how you guys came to settle on the topics for your seasons, for the subsequent seasons. Maybe starting with season 2 and going forward. And then Leon, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Fiasco seasons as well.
Sure.
Like, what makes a good slow burn story, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've come to sort of prize more than anything is, in addition to the stories needing to be about present and into the past, or at least being somehow relevant to the present enough to the present that they help us process what's happening around us. In addition to that, which I think is very much in the DNA of Slow Burn, I look for a story that has a lot of primary sources. I think a lot of sort of documentaries you see on, especially like just like ones that are sort of thrown together, are often sort of like fully clip jobs, just like with people who are all secondary sources, historians, journalists. And I think we want always to get closer to the bone, and that means choosing stories that took place recently enough that people are alive. And then the other thing I think is that you want the stories to be broad enough and big enough that they offer you 6 or 8 or whatever number of entry points that are different from each other. You want a story that can sustain narrative that happens at various scales. Some of them world historical, and others more intimate and personal. So like with Fiasco, like we did Iran Contra, and that ended up being about Vietnam and the Cold War and terrorism in the Middle East and Central America and Hollywood colliding with politics in the form of scandal. And then you had we also had like an episode in there about Bud McFarlane, who is in some ways the architect of the Iran arms sales. He told us about his decision-making process and why he thought this was a good idea and why he changed his mind. And that was a very personal story about, old age and regret and defiance. And I think for me, like choosing a story requires you to find something that has all those different gears that you can work in.
So why'd you pick the Monica story? Just to choose one example.
Not a very not high-minded reason, which was that we were batting around a bunch of ideas, and I think the Clinton impeachment was sort of the first thing that occurred to us as a group, and I was really kind of against it at first, and I thought it was too obvious. Like okay, like we'll do the other impeachment, and then a friend of mine was like, "You're going to be so mad if someone else does it, and it's going to be really popular, and you're going to regret it." And that was like, that like flipped a light switch in my head. I was like, yes, I will feel exactly that way. And so I went for it.
And Joel, you obviously had a slightly different task. You had to kind of reimagine Slow Burn with a new host, and you also took it in a kind of totally new direction. Can you talk a little bit about, like, I actually don't know this. Did you pitch Slate or vice versa? Was it a kind of open conversation? How did it come about?
Yeah, I'm almost more curious to hear Josh and Gabriel Roth, talk about how they came up with the idea for that season, because they approached me about doing the Biggie and Tupac season. And, to be honest, and no offense, Leon, I had not heard this. I listened to like one podcast. It was like the Dan Le Batard show, and it's like, it takes all day. So I wasn't a huge podcast listener.
If the Le Batard show wasn't as long, then you would have listened to Slow Burn years ago.
It literally takes about 2 hours of your day. So you really got to find the time, right? So when they pitched it to me, I had not thought at all about getting into, to leaving the job I was at or doing anything else. But when they brought it up, I was like, oh, you know what? There's a chance to do something really interesting here, because and if you listen to the season 3, you'll know that the people that covered hip hop around that time, they were either very young, they were not people that were necessarily trained in journalism, they were writers, and they learned journalism sort of on the fly, or you had people at mainstream media outlets that covered hip hop as sort of a curiosity, like there was not, sort of any rigor or, specificity to any of the coverage of the hip hop. So I said, well, we could actually apply, I've covered, I've been in journalism for almost 20 years now, and I've covered almost everything. And I was like, well, maybe there's a way to apply, the tenets of narrative journalism to this story in a way that I hadn't necessarily seen anywhere else. And so that was appealing to me. And, in fact, it's Leon's talking to his buddy. And so I worked at ESPN before I came to Slate, and I remember I was talking with a friend of mine about doing a podcast on Biggie and Tupac, and the way that he lit up. He'd like I cover college football, and nobody gives a shit about any of the stuff I was covering. And when I mentioned the opportunity to do this, he lit up, and I was like, you know what? This is something worth pursuing. So, but yeah, I don't, Josh, why Biggie and Tupac? I don't know.
We were just like Leon said, we were batting around a bunch of different ideas, and this was one that came up that I think we were all excited about, just for the opportunity to show that you could tell these kinds of stories, that not just about politics, and just sort of like expand the widen the aperture a bit. And so, once we settled on this as a story that we thought we wanted to tell in this series. I mean, Joel, I knew you a little bit. You'd been on Hang Up and Listen before. We knew each other just through sports journalism, and I knew your feature writing, and I knew you were a hip hop fan. But I think it was also a good thing that you had not written about this story, that you hadn't really done journalism on hip hop, because one of the reasons that Leon seasons were so great, especially the first one, was that you had the sense as a listener of learning along with him. And if we had somebody do it who was really already familiar with the story, you don't want to have the feeling like somebody's lecturing you. You want to have the feeling that the host is sort of on the same level, and I'm excited about learning something, and I'm excited about telling you what I learned. And I think one of the things I was excited about as a listener for this season, Joel, was that there was a lot written back then, and there has been since, documentaries about Biggie and Tupac, but it's so much of it is it's hard to know what's true, what's exaggerated. And so I thought one of the and this turned out to be correct, like one of the things that you could do was just sort of sift through everything that's been done, talk to the people that were there, and kind of provide that service for listeners. Like, here's what really happened, and here's and I thought that this was the kind of story that would really benefit from having somebody as like smart and invested as you were to do that.
And then, Josh, how did the David Duke season come about?
I'd wanted to do a David Duke thing for a really long time. It was on my to-do list. And most things as a journalist, maybe it's just me, but on my to-do list just never get done.
No, it's not just you.
So I was like, ooh, an opportunity it's always very satisfying to check something off, whether it's go to the grocery store or do in-depth long-form journalism on David Duke. So I had wanted to do something about it. I had the opportunity to do it at Slate. There was some conversation around, would this work as a slow burn? Should we do it as something separate? I guess ultimately we decided it would work for slow burn. It's a little distinct from the other stories in being something that I think is less remembered, or was obviously a huge deal in Louisiana. And to some degree, it was a big deal nationally, but it hasn't really persisted in the kind of cultural memory in the same way that these other three stories did. And so it was sort of taking the series in another direction again, but it hits all the things that Leon was saying. Like, thematically, it's super interesting. You can come at the story in a bunch of different ways and pursue a lot of different angles that feel extremely relevant to today, along with it just being an interesting story in its own right. And then another thing that I would add, and maybe this is just like trying to excuse my own decision making, but like, I think the fact that at the end I felt like there was another 6 episodes I could have done, or another whole bunch of things that I could have explored, like more meat on the bone. I think you need that. Like, you don't want to come to the end of a season and be like, well, I wrung an extra 2 episodes out of that I don't think should have been in there. Like, you want it to be big enough that it feels like you're only like really scratching the surface of this topic, and you're leaving stuff out that could have been good enough to be in.
Yeah, maybe you should do the first slow burn to book deal. If you still feel like
oh man, I do not want to do it. I do not want to spend any more time with David Duke, like mentally.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, Noreen, can you say how your season came up then? Because I don't know a lot about the story.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Slate came to me and asked me if I was interested in. I was working as an editor at New York Magazine, and I'd done podcasting for Slate, but a very different kind of podcasting. I used to do the Double X Gabfest, then called The Waves. They asked if I was interested in sort of pitching a slow burn, and they pitched one to me that I wasn't. I don't know if I could say, Josh, what the topic was.
I would not say.
Okay. So then,
leave them wanting more, Noreen.
Right. So there was a topic that I was not interested in, but then I turned around and pitched the lead up to the Iraq War, which isn't necessarily something that is as much in my wheelhouse, and that was part of why I was interested in it. The sort of backstory is that I was in late high school when the Iraq War happened, and it was sort of the beginning of my political consciousness, really. And I was not from a Bush-loving household. I was not in favor of the Iraq War. And I sort of had the moral high ground there on my now husband, who, was actually a Slate intern when the Iraq invasion happened. So like a lot of people at places like Slate and the New Republic, he was all for it.
Was he the first ever Slate intern?
I don't know about that.
I heard that rumor.
Maybe, possibly. But so we would. But
that's
he had this
definitely not true. But I won't. I'll mute myself so he can still claim that title.
He just poked his head and was like, "Are you talking about me?" Don't come in. But so we'd gotten in a lot of sort of. I basically did not actually understand the views that, like, I had the principle in mind, but I didn't before this know a ton about why I believed what I believed. And I was also intrigued that so many people who'd worked at places where I worked subsequently and had political views that sometimes weren't all that different from mine, just sort of, generic liberals, were in favor of this war. And so it was sort of a personal investigation, almost like, how could all of these smart people gone for this very, very, very bad idea? Tune in next year to find out.
Are you embracing that? Like, are you going to embrace that, like your perspective and your like personal investment in it?
I don't know. What do you guys think? Should I? I feel awkward sometimes talking about myself, but what do you think? Should I do it?
I feel like it really helps in a podcast. Like, I think people really want, like, that thing that Josh was referring to, like giving people the sense that they are on a journey with you, whether it's a journey to figure out, learn a story you knew nothing about, or in your case, like interrogate sort of your instincts that you grew up with. I don't know. I feel like people always really respond really, they really respond to those moments when you kind of break the fourth wall. And obviously, like, this podcast is not a personal podcast. Like, I think there's plenty of podcasts that, go way too far in terms of centering the narrator. But, and I think it's often sort of just a device, right, to like explain how something happened, is like, I learned about it in this order. But I think with Slow Burn, and I think we've carried this over into Fiasco, like, we try to sort of use our own, like, the limits of our own knowledge as almost like a baseline for our listeners, like, or as a stand-in for our listeners. Like, we can't guess, what people are going to come to the show with. And so instead of trying to sort of triangulate and make it, perfect for everybody, whether it's an expert or a total novice, just use yourself as like the barometer and the baseline, and it'll be authentic and honest, and people will be able to relate to it, even if they fall on one side or the other of that, that line.
What
Joel,
do you guys have?
Yeah, I was going to say, Joel, I think you and I are similarly hesitant to insert ourselves in the story. Like, I definitely got that sense from working with you on your season and in mine as well. I had to be pushed to put myself in more.
But I was jealous when I heard you do it. when you talk, like I'm thinking of the scene from the first episode when you're at Tiger Stadium talking about feeling uncomfortable, watching people glad hand with David Duke. And I thought, maybe I should have included more myself. But yeah, I started off. We're all journalists here, but I'm uncomfortable inserting myself in a story. I'm not a first person writer. I don't do columns, and so that's really difficult for me. And so I kind of battled with that in the writing process, like how much of myself is worth putting in here. How even hearing my voice in the middle of interviews, I was like, do we really need to hear me talking to somebody, because I'm talking all the damn time. So
you can still hear like a searching quality in even if you're not literally using the vertical pronoun, like it's still palpably like your process of discovery and understanding.
Is the vertical pronoun a thing? Wait, can we pause on that for a second? Where did you get that from?
I think I picked it up from Mark Feeney at the Boston Globe, who writes about photography there.
What is it?
It refers to the
vertical pronoun.
It refers to I.
Oh wow. Okay. So it's kind of like a Homeric epithet for the letter I.
Yeah.
Okay. I like that way of thinking about it, though. That being on a journey sounds like such a horrible storytelling cliche.
I know.
But it's better than
I was looking for another word. I couldn't find one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, like the Iraq War, but about me is kind of a horrible take. Well, so
I think we all need to. Back to you, Joel. Like, I think we all need to be told by our editors and friends and peers and whoever listens, like, we need to be given permission to include ourselves and validation that our investment or
it's not embarrassing
in the story. Yeah, that it's interesting because it feels self-indulgent. Like, why would somebody be interested in like what and how I was connected to David Duke? It's not like inherently interesting. Like, it's interesting because of my position in relation to the story. But like, my thoughts on it aren't any more interesting inherently than anybody else's thoughts. At least like that's my like baseline low opinion of my own opinion. And when we sent around, maybe we can transition into a conversation about this, but like when we sent around rough cuts on episode 1 of Slow Burn 4, the biggest difference of opinion was, should I discuss my connection to the story in the beginning? Should I discuss it at the end? No matter where it is, should it be bigger or should it be smaller? There's more of myself in there than there was when I first wrote it, and there's less of me in there than a lot of people thought should be in there. But yeah, I guess the thing I'm interested in is like, Leon, I know from being in the process that some of the episodes changed a lot from beginning to end, but like, what springs to mind when you think about an episode of a slow burn that really changed dramatically from when you were from first draft or when you were conceptualizing it to when it aired? Was there a particular one that springs to mind?
Or a fiasco?
Thanks, Noreen. I think it's like, maybe it's a cop out of an answer, but honestly, like the first one, I always remember, like, so the first 3 episodes of Slow Burn 1 were, in the end, were Martha Mitchell, Wright Patman, who is like the congressman who kind of took the first stand against Nixon on Watergate and tried to investigate it before anyone else really cared about it. And the third one was sort of about the journalists, the Woodwards and Bernsteins and Leslie Stalls, who tried and failed to make it, a story that people cared about in time for the election in 1972. I think all 3 of those, subplots were episode 1 to get one after the other. And I think Martha Mitchell was just the lead, and then we got into Wright Patman, and then we ended up at Woodward and Bernstein.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, and then realizing like, oh wait, like if we just slow this down, like, and let the Martha Mitchell story breathe, and just have it be ultra focused on her, and then do the same thing for these other 2 subplots, like they're each going to be better and richer. And instead of sort of trying to string them together and find, elegant ways to justify having them all be part of the same thing, just split them up. And that was like a really important insight. Like today we're currently like outlining season 4 of Fiasco, and we were sort of like talking about the timeline and sort of figuring out which chunks of the timeline might go in which episodes. And certain things resonate with each other in the story we're going to be telling. That I don't want to say yet what it is, but I will. I think we'll be able to say soon. The thing I sort of kept telling myself and my colleagues was like, we do better when we keep it simple and don't like try to put a bunch of stuff together in one. Like, let's divide them up. Let's have each one be really linear, really tight, and really like focused instead of trying to make like an A plot and a B plot and then go A, B, 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 A, and then, or A, B, A, B, just like, it'll be better if they're separate. And I think that first experience with those first 3 episodes kind of instilled that in me.
What about you other two? Are there any episodes that stand out that you changed dramatically from first concept to, airtime?
Well, speaking for season 3, definitely episode 2, because I think like chronology bedeviled me a little bit. Like, okay, we always knew that episode 1 was going to start with Tupac being shot the first time at the studio in Manhattan, right? And so that was always going to be where we opened the podcast, opened the season. And then I was ready, right after that, Tupac, a couple days later, gets sentenced to prison and then goes off to prison. And so it's like, okay, well, we should just go ahead and follow that out. But then, talking with Josh and Gabe, we said, you know what, let's slow down. Like, it's as you mentioned, Leon, let's slow down the story here. Maybe there's a chance. Let's place the readers in the context of that moment, how Tupac ended up shot, why he was facing all of these, money troubles and legal troubles. And so episode 2 just sort of happened like that. We were like, well, you know what, let's get the build up to how Tupac became famous, how he ended up, in a room with somebody that would accuse him of sexual assault and going on that way. So that was not what we had in the initial outline for the season, but it just seemed to make the most sense, because otherwise you didn't understand why Tupac was a troubled person other than the fact that he'd been shot. But there was so much more to the story. So definitely that one for me.
And you also were able to include the background of the larger story of the relationship between hip hop and the police, kind of stepping out of chronology and even stepping out of Tupac's individual story and providing some of that background. And that's always a decision to be made, is like when you step out of your main story to fill in that kind of context. And there's just like the amazing fact of, the murderer in Texas having the Tupac tape in his tape deck, and that kind of allowing you to tell that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I mean, there was that. And just talking about Tupac as sort of like he inherited the legacy of Ice-T and NWA and that sort of stuff. So, we didn't, I didn't quite understand that Tupac was sort of, next. What Tupac is famous for is a lot of the music he did on Death Row, which is a lot more indulgent, not, a lot more of the stuff that people are a little bit more critical of. But he started out as what people might call a conscious rapper. He's the son of a Black Panther, and hit the music he made, speaking out against police brutality. That came from a very real place, and so that we needed to have that in there for the rest of the story to make sense, I think.
Josh, did you do any U-turns?
The 4th episode in season 4 was from the very beginning kind of a concept in search of a story, which I think is not generally the way I would advise anyone to do journalism, to like have the idea and then go out and look for a way to fill it in, which is maybe why it took me the longest to figure out how to do it. It ended up that was the episode about the Senate race, and the lead, I really wanted to capture this feeling. The whole time I knew, like, this is what the vibe that I want to get across here is like, growing up, one of my biggest memories is these enormous Duke signs, the blue sign with a white lettering, and how they were in certain places and they came to mean a certain thing. And it became about something much bigger than politics. It was a statement that really transcended any sort of individual election. And so this idea of like merchandise and iconography being so important in this race, but also being the signifier. And I just kept looking for a way into that story. And we eventually found, it's the lead of that episode, a couple stories. There's one about in St. Bernard Parish outside New Orleans, the story of this Black family that moves into a white subdivision. And when they're about to move in, there are 13 David Duke for Senate signs that get placed on the front lawn of their new house. And that really kind of captured exactly what I was trying to capture. And so it just took a very long time for me to, I knew that it was true because I had been there. And so just to figure out a way to make that come across to people through storytelling was a challenge.
Side note, Josh, did you know that Amy Coney Barrett, the possible Trump nominee for the Supreme Court, is from Metairie, which plays such a role in your season?
I did know that. I think I forgot it, and now I remember it. But I did know that at one point. But yeah,
I feel like it made me understand a little bit more about her, having listened to your podcast.
Fair play, yeah.
So one thing that we actually all have in common is that none of us are sort of people who came up through the ranks of NPR or This American Life. We are all print or digital, sort of written people. And, I'm currently in the process of figuring all of this out. Maybe you guys can talk a little bit about what the switch was like, what surprised you about making a podcast as opposed to writing a magazine or website story. Like how is the writing different, for one thing?
I thought that I had sort of learned it all by editing Leon's scripts, but then I realized once I started doing it myself that even if you thought you've trained yourself and you can catch what the rhythms and the sort of concepts are of writing for audio, it's different when you have to do it yourself and kind of unlearn the stuff that you had learned before. But I think, Leon, since you were the first to go, maybe you should talk.
Well, in terms of the writing itself, like the sort of lessons I figured out were all kind of mechanical, like shorter sentences, fewer names, sometimes fewer dates, other times more dates to like make sure people know what time it is. More repetition because people are going to zone out sometimes and you're going to need to, kind of, sort of bolster the foundation every once in a while to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Have you thought about just screaming sometimes to make sure people are paying attention?
Well, actually, I mean, the equivalent of screaming is being like, as I told you earlier, or like, as you'll hear in a subsequent episode, like all this sort of like, scaffolding that you can show if you choose to. It's the thing I always want to avoid. You
don't feel like a big failure every time you say, as I told you earlier?
100%. That's my point. That's like the equivalent of screaming to me.
You might have forgotten. Right.
Yeah, you might have forgotten because I suck at this. Like that,
idiot.
So like, yeah, learning how to structure stories that in a way that's totally intuitive. It doesn't require a lot of focus on the part of a listener. It was really hard. And I'm not sure I can really articulate like how we prevail on that. I think sometimes we do, other times we don't. Especially with like a really complicated story with, like the 2000 election recount where you have 30 or more lawsuits flying back and forth, or you're on Contra where you have not just, the US government, but the Sandinistas and the Contras and the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. And it's just like a lot to keep track of. And so, part of it is like doing the thing I was saying earlier, which is like divide everything up as much as you can, keep it separate, and don't expect your listeners to just hold everything in their head at once. But actually for me, the thing that's been a lot harder, or maybe that I would like to think was a lot harder, but now I've sort of figured it out, was changing how I interview. For print, like, you don't have to worry about whether someone said something well. You don't have to worry about whether they sound animated or whether they sound invested or whether, they said in the exact wrong place, or whether there's an upcut at the end of a story that they're telling so that it sounds like shit if you just leave it in without finding a way to, maybe move something minor to the end so that it sounds like they're finishing their thought. It's just like a level of awareness that I did not have during interviews at the beginning. And now I'm like a lot better at it. Andrew Parsons, our producer, who started Slow Burn with us, and now produces Fiasco, like he was being in my ear during interviews being like, ask them to tell that story again. Just like tell them, do it again, but do it shorter. Or like tell them you want to, just revisit something they said 30 minutes, just really unnatural kind of instructions, almost like coaching that I have learned are totally necessary because, every once in a while, like you'll hear someone tell a story and as they're telling it that it's not going to work for one reason or another. And then every once in a while you ask them to tell it again and they just give it to you. And so I've kind of embraced that aspect of it, even though it feels a little bit, almost like, almost like a different process than interviewing for a piece of writing.
And it's really a team sport. I mean, that's the other thing that seems really different from writing. Like it's just kind of you and the page, and eventually your editor comes in. But we're all lucky enough to have a research assistant or assistant producer in addition to the producer in your ear. And I feel like that is like a really nice difference between print and podcasting.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and even, briefly circling back to Leon's point, learning how you interview for audio is so different because I'll never forget Christopher Johnson, our great producer for seasons 3 and 4. I think the first couple of interviews, I like to make them like a conversation. You want people to feel comfortable. And so you're being very affirmative when they talk. You're like, oh yeah, okay. And then
the Michael Barbaro, I do that.
Yeah, right. And then like Christopher was like, he didn't say it like this, but basically, like, could you just shut up? Like let them talk so that your voice isn't over, you're not bleeding into their audio. And that's just something that you don't think about. And so in fact, I got to a point when I would interview people before, I'd say, hey, look, you may say something incredibly funny and I may not laugh, but because I don't want to get in the way of the story you're telling here, right? But that's something you have to learn. Like why would we know that until we start doing it?
Yeah. It's not bad advice for print though, either, to just get out of the way as I interrupt everyone.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you should always shut up. People want to fill the uncomfortable silence. Leon, is it fair to give me credit or blame for the fact that there's an explanation of what whitewater is? I remember fighting about that.
No, we didn't fight. I knew you were right. I don't think I ever put up a fight. The thing Josh was referring to
this is you. We don't need to put whitewater in. Nobody cares about that. It's too complicated. It's boring. That was you.
I found it helpful as a listener.
Well, in the end, we did it. Yeah. So Josh had to kind of force me into like figuring out what the hell happened with whitewater, and of course I'm glad he did. And it was a real challenge to explain it in a couple hundred words, without just losing your way. However, I got to tell you, maybe you know this already, but SNL did a whitewater explainer in like '93. In the form of a "We Are the World" style song, like sung by a bunch of celebrities, and they just like in 3 minutes they explained it so well with so many like precise details and so much interpretive, like it's such like a robust interpretive. I was just like, how did they do this? And I like want to know what consultant they hired to explain it to them so that they could do that, because I could have really used one for sure.
You did great, and I don't want to say exactly what, or even not exactly, Noreen, but I think one of your first challenges as a slow burn scriptwriter was like you are having to explain a particular complicated thing for your first episode, and that's something that you've been wrestling with.
Oh yeah, very active wrestling problem. I'll figure it out, I hope.
We know you will.
Well, so this is kind of a negative question, but what were you guys most worried about with your seasons? Like, beyond does Whitewater go in or not? What was sort of the nagging, like, editorial problem that you needed to solve? And maybe we already talked about this enough with, the switch that you made. But is there anything else that stands out to you?
With the Clinton season, we thought it was like really devastating that we weren't getting to talk to Monica Lewinsky. Just because like so much of the project was about like figuring out what this was like for her, and there was a little bit of material to draw on, like her autobiography and an interview that she taped for HBO, a couple other things, a couple of interviews she gave at the time. But it really felt like we were missing something without her voice in the show. This is now kind of my mantra with regard to like big ticket gets like that, is if you get them, like, great, you can make a lot out of it when it happens. But every time it doesn't happen, you can turn into an opportunity to do something even more original than you thought that was possible, because it forces you to find a different voice, forces you to find a different way in. I think a lot of what we did in Slow Burn 1 and 2 was find these sort of side characters that, as we called them sometimes, before remembering they were real people, that sort of gave us new perspectives on a story that might have otherwise been familiar. And so, these days, like, if we didn't get Bud McFarlane for the Iran-Contra season of Fiasco until very late in the game. Talk about an episode that we had to totally tear up and start over. Like, we had a whole episode written about the origins of the Iran arms sales that didn't include Bud McFarlane, and we were relying on all these other people who could sort of piece it together for us. But then he came through and said yes, and we very happily tore the whole thing up and started over. It forces you to find creative solutions to the problem, and I think that's always ends up being better.
Yeah. Do you guys ever find yourself sort of reading the news with a slow burn eye and thinking about, like, okay, in 20 years, this is how this is going to get codified? It's, these are like, Dr. Fauci will be a side character, or maybe he'll be the protagonist. I don't know. But like, do you have that muscle now?
Yeah. I mean, how can you live through this year and not think of all the many different, narrative threads that are going to come out of it? I mean, you could do a whole slow burn on George Floyd, and everything around that, right? So, yeah, I'm constantly. I mean, whereas before, and I don't know if Leon and Josh or Noreen are like this, but where I used to think in terms of, okay, this is how I'm going to. All my stories that I'm working on are for print or for online, and now I'm thinking, oh, what would make a really good podcast, a narrative podcast, and like if one news event happens, I'm like, okay, the NBA strike, the Wildcat strike from a couple weeks ago. I was like, oh man, I bet someday that, like, when people are willing to talk and get behind that, I bet that'll be a great podcast. So yeah, it's like really hard to turn that part of your brain off once you've turned it on, I think.
Yeah, set a calendar alert in 5 years. You can do that.
Leon talked about Anthony Scaramucci in the first episode of Slow Burn season 1 as an example of somebody who might be forgotten, correctly identified. But I wonder if in 30 years, let's say, there have been a lot of people who worked in the Trump administration who have since left and have written books or done interviews. And then there's this other set of people who have, like, stuck around through the whole mess. And so I'm wondering if when these stories are revisited by people doing projects like this or otherwise, whether there will be that divide, like how people who actually stuck around, like, will we be interested in hearing their stories and their self-justifications? Will that will those self-justifications feel different than the kinds of self-justifications we hear from other people? Will we put them in, like, some special, like, some special category, or will we be just like, will we be grateful to hear their accounts? I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm gonna do a little bit of a lightning round, a fast burn, if you will, to wrap things up. And so I'm just gonna go kind of around the horn. Leon, Joel, Josh, just, not a one-word answer, but make it fast. So what is the best piece of audio that you got that never got aired?
Am I going first?
Yeah, Leon.
Well, I think I was going to say that. I mean, it would have been the tape of Linda Tripp saying it was fine that I recorded her secretly, but we ended up using it. So I feel like that was hard to beat. But I think we sort of aired our best stuff.
Okay.
Well, we aired this audio for the live shows, but it didn't turn up in the podcast. It was definitely Biggie's childhood friend, Chico Delvec, telling us a story about how he and Biggie got a call from Tupac one day to get flowers and a gun and bring it to Tupac's suite in Manhattan. They get there, bring them the flowers and the gun. The gun is for Tupac. The flowers were for Madonna, who was in the bedroom, and she came out of the bedroom, kissed Biggie and Chico on the cheek, and the reason we had to put it in the live show is because like that's just too good of a story to not air somewhere. So yeah, definitely that.
We gave all of our best stuff to the listeners, Noreen. Why would we hoard that for ourselves? I asked this guy Ray Strother, who is a consultant for Buddy Roemer. He kept talking about the cookies in the governor's mansion. I just kept asking him more and more questions about the cookies because I've found it so hilarious during our conversation, and we put all that in. I'm not gonna if I find it amusing, then I'm not gonna just have private laughs about it.
All right, good stuff. Okay, favorite interview, Leon.
Linda Tripp, easy.
Okay.
I remember how excited Leon was about that. I remember you calling me to tell me about it. That's one of my favorite slow burn memories, is getting that call from you about that.
Yeah, if we ever had time, I would love to hear about the decision about when to start recording. But anyway, how you guys wrote that in there. But for me, it was definitely Matty C, who was the guy who I guess is sort of responsible for introducing Biggie to Puffy. And he was an A&R for Loud Records and, managed some groups, Mobb Deep and all of that. But mostly he was just so fucking cool, man. I like that guy. I like when he left, I was like, man, you want to hang out? Or, I just felt that way about him. He's really cool. So, anyway.
Cool. Josh?
Mine was Edwin Edwards, the governor, and also just because of the complicated relay system with his wife having to read the questions to him. It just growing up in that state and him being just this kind of towering figure, and then being able to speak with him in his 90s and have him be so himself and just so game to answer anything, and being able to figure out how to do it during the pandemic and have it work and be good audio was awesome.
Yeah, pandemic audio is hard.
Yeah, if I can go back and answer your question about the biggest challenge, was this was the slow burn during the pandemic, people. And Noreen, yours is too.
Yeah. The problem is mine is, well, we'll talk about that later. I'm worried that people will judge it for the audio quality when they have forgotten the pandemic, but whatever. Who's the person that you most wish you'd gotten to talk to but didn't or couldn't?
So I mentioned Monica Lewinsky, obviously.
Right.
Because I sort of implied, I actually think it was probably for the best that we didn't get her. The person I would say I wish we'd gotten, if I could mention Fiasco, on the 2000 election Florida recount season, we didn't get either Al Gore or George W. Bush. And it's fine because really, the show sort of thrives, I think, when it's in the weeds, or at least not in the weeds, but rather in the wings. I think that's the better metaphor. You want the people around the main characters, not the main characters themselves. And yet, like, I still really want to know how Al Gore feels about the whole thing, and whether he, has identified the exact moment when he made the wrong choice, or one of his advisors gave him the wrong advice. But he declined.
Joel.
Yeah. So two people really hard to pick from. One is Tupac's wife, who he was actually married to while he was in prison. And we had a great time. I met her at the Red Robin in Harlem. We had lunch. She came to the podcast release party, and she just refused to go to submit to being interviewed. But she had great stories, and I know that we were just scratching the surface. And then the other one was a guy named Keefe D, who is believed to have been the guy who killed Tupac, and has been identified by the police as such. And I actually had a very uncomfortable conversation with him one night, where he explained to me why he did not want to be in the podcast. He's very cordial about it, very nice, but he was not into participating in this project.
Josh?
Yeah, as kind of explained before, I just wish I had gotten more people that were in Duke's orbit. I didn't want to talk to Duke himself, as explained on the show, but people that could kind of, speak to what it was like to be around him. And I think it's possible that we could have gotten or had a better opportunity if we were able to travel. Like, one of the things I was excited about with doing this series was like an excuse to go home a bunch. That didn't end up panning out. And so I think that I'm not sure how, but I'm sure it shaped, the show would have been different if that hadn't been the case.
Okay, very last question. What is a future slow burn or fiasco that you would like to do someday? Leon?
Well, so we just finished the story of how the civil rights movement came north in the form of the desegregation movement in Boston. We've got two in the chamber that I will tell people about shortly, but not yet.
You can't be asking people to reveal their secrets, Noreen.
That's tough. Well, you could come up with like your third favorite idea.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a story that you don't want to do, but pretend that you want to do it, just to throw people off the trail?
Okay, all right. Here's a different question, guys. Within the last 2 years, what do you think is the event that will make the best slow burn someday? So maybe it's George Floyd. Well, I'll let you guys go.
It's the same question. Not quite.
Well, not for me. I actually had an answer for your question, but yeah, I think George Floyd, man. Well, that may be too narrow. Let me think about it. You guys go first, and I'll come back on.
What was the parameters? Just things that are very current?
Last 2 years, yeah.
Last 2 years, okay. Josh, you go first.
This is the worst possible question, Noreen. We're gonna leave people on such a down note. They're gonna be so angry that they ended up watching this historic live stream. No, I think I'd be interested to think about the pandemic, obviously, through this lens, but it's not over yet. Like, we don't know what the shape of it is. There's no way to have distance from anything that's happening right now that we're living through and participating in, but particularly this, just because it's annoying when like in the news today, there's a report like Fauci says the earliest we could be back to normal is the end of 2021. It's like, even you don't know, dude. Like, I don't think that you actually know when we're gonna be back to normal. Yeah. And so it just feels like, obviously there's so much to say and will be so much to say about like what the fuck is happening to all of us right now.
Not to be too obvious, by the way. I mean, I feel like saying the pandemic. That's a cop out. I mean,
I've got one. What, okay. You could do one about you could do one on the Trump era, just with every episode is a different person that he's pardoned.
That's good. Breaking form. I like it.
Yeah.
All right, we are officially like over time. So thank you to everyone for tuning in. And tomorrow, if you want to skip Netflix again and watch Slate, the Culture Gabfest is doing a live stream. Same time, I believe, 8 p.m. So consider joining us again for that. Thank you all for listening.
Check out Fiasco.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Check out
thanks.
Fiasco.
Fiasco, only on Luminary.
And Slow Burn.
Thanks, everyone.